Hi Charlie, we're going to have a look at this stock control system when you're using binary files. Before we do that, we want to compare it to text, so we're going to bring some thoughts about text files first of all. It's a good idea with this program to have either your text file or binary file created beforehand and it's just nothing in it, but that will be useful. We will just pick it up from here where we've got something like this, just to remind ourselves that we've got that class and that we've got an array of records. Let's just do it with a text file so we can talk about a binary file. I want to be able to compare the two. So really quickly then, we need a file object fh equals open. We have to have, there has to be the name of the file, which passes an argument. We've got this one as stock.txt. That's enough arguments, it will work, but you can also put in another one which is going to specify the mode in which you're opening that file. By default it's read, so we want to change that and put in W. First thing we want to write is the metadata, how many files we've got, so we use fh.write. Notice that open is an object and therefore this subroutine is actually a method. You know, the write method is attached to this particular file object called fh. That's why we're doing fh.write. In other words, we're using object-oriented programming. What is the thing that we're writing? Well, it's len of items. Get comfortable with the idea of this array of records is still an array, so it does all the things that arrays do. You know, you've just got, happens to be that the data type in each one is one that you've defined called item. Now then, one of the problems of course with text files is that you can only write strings to them, so I have to cast that because at the moment it's an integer, and we create a string object actually is what you've got there. Just check you've got the right number of brackets, 1 2 3 open, 1 2 3 closed. It looks good. I also have to do a new line, so it's not a massive problem using a text file with this. It's just that you have to put in new lines and you also have to make sure that everything is text. That can be a bit fiddly when you come to read all the data from a text file because you've got to convert it back into the relevant data types, and you've also got to strip it as well to get rid of these new lines, but it's not a major problem for this particular project. Then we're going to iterate through all of the items in the array, all of the elements in the array, and we're going to start writing them. Just think about what's the first thing you want written. I want keyboard written. I'm going to just loop through. I'll say for count. This is kind of how AQA sort of do their programming. They have this sort of particular style. For count in range, and they'll go 0 to len of items. You can see why within using this range, which is an object by the way, it never achieves this top one, and it's because it's so that you can write this kind of statement that len of items, the length of it will be one more than the index of the last item in there, so that's why it never achieves that last one. So you can just write an expression like that, and in actual fact by default you don't need the 0, you can just have len of items, so that's why it does that. You could have done this differently. You could have iterated through the array and just said for x in items, but this is maybe more like how AQA would do it, and I think it's maybe a little clearer, even though it's not as quick. We want to do some writing. fh.write. What's the thing we want to write? Well, I want to get hold of this keyboard to begin with. How do I do that? Well, I need to get the array. Which item in the array do you want? Well, I want the first one. In this case it's going to be count. So items count, just think about what count is. Count is 0 initially, so items count is this one. And what attribute do you want to access? Name. Notice that I don't use getter method in this case just because our attributes are public. Okay, and that's what we've got. I do have this other slight irritation of having to write in a new line, so we'll put that new line in, and then we can start to do the same thing with cost as well. Let's just copy and paste that, and we'll put in, we also want it as cost. That's not going to work because this thing here, items count, which is one of these, in this case is the first one, cost, that 3 is a float, and of course with text files it's got to be a string, so we will have to cast it and create a string object. Just count your brackets, 1, 2, 1, 2, looks good. And again, another thing, I've got to make sure that I've got this new line in each time. I think that's going to work. Just finish off, another method of the file object is close, which will close the file. Effectively your file has been opened into RAM, it's now gets stored back into the hard drive just by doing fh.close and just run it. Oh, looks like we're free of errors. Let's just check that we've got that it's looking good. That's looking good. Just check that you've got new lines each time. Yeah, that's fine. So I know you know this stuff, but I just want us to be able to compare how we go about now looking at a binary file, and also just a bit of motivation that we're having to cast, put new line. We've got some more casting and new lines, and in this case it was okay, and when we come to retrieve all this data we got to know which bits of data, which strings need to be cast back into the appropriate data type. But it doesn't take long within our programming that when we start dealing with data with different types of data types, some could be arrays, dictionaries, etc. Using text files becomes a little cumbersome, so we'll try and compare what we've done here to binary files. Okay, now we've got our program working with a text file. We're going to improve it a little bit by creating a binary file. Now we're going to import a module. We'll import pickle, and it's good to get used to modules that people have written. This pickle would have been developed after Open was made. So Open is part of the main Python programming language, but somebody later on has come and created their own module, pickle, which you can import and use. So let's just look at the differences. Well, the first thing is you can have a file handle, open, but instead of a text file it needs to be a binary file. We're going to call it a pickle file. We'll go .p. There are various different options you can have here, and the mode is going to be write binary, so that's our first little difference. We are going to write to the file, but write is a method which works with open, and just notice how it works. We've got the fh.write, it's object orientated, so that method was attached to that fh. Pickle doesn't do that, of course. Pickle doesn't interact with open in that way. In fact, the pickle library is just very straightforward functions, the kinds of functions that you start off with. So we're going to get one of the functions, which is the dump function. I've got to go pickle.dump. Now don't be put off by that dot. It's just the way that we are importing all these different non-runnable bits of code from this pickle import that we've got. If you don't want to do that, just change this to from pickle import everything. Let's do that in actual fact. From pickle import everything. And it's a bit dangerous if you're doing lots of imports, because you might have some clashes of names of things. You don't quite know what you might be getting, but we'll do it in this case just so we're not getting confused with this dot notation. We're just saying dump is a function, a subroutine that's been written. It doesn't interact as a method with open, it is just a function, and we can pass it some information. So there's two arguments that dump takes. It needs to know the data that you want to write to it. So where it's, in this case, len of items, just put that in. You see that len of items like we had there. And then the other thing that you have to say is, where do you want to write it to? And we've got this file handle fh that we write fh. Just notice fh is an object, and objects can be passed as arguments to functions. You can pass lots of things as arguments to functions actually, but so that's how it's working. So dump is just a subroutine that's been written. It's not a method, it's not part of the open class, so we don't say, for instance, fh.dump. We can't do that. It's just been written after open has been defined. Anyway, I'm waffling on a bit, sorry. That's a slight improvement on this one because we don't have to cast it. We don't have to say string, so we can get rid of that. And also, we don't have to say write new line. It just is saved a piece of data for us. And you can save lots and lots of data to the same file. You just keep saying dump each time. So in this bit, let's just do this. We're going to write dump, and it has to take 2 arguments. It's got to put in the thing that you want to dump in, the bit of information, which is that. So I'm just going to copy that and put it into dump, and also the file that where you want to dump it, and we're using that file handle fh. So that's really good. I don't need that, and I don't need the new line either. And then in this one, let's dump this cost. So dump, and in here we're going to go items count. Let me just copy this little bit. That's the data that we're storing. Where are we storing it? In fh. Notice that we don't need to cast it. We don't need to change the data type. It will preserve the data type when we put it into the binary file. I also don't need a new line as well. So you can see that actually storing things into a binary file is fairly straightforward, and it's certainly it's going to be a lot easier to open the thing as well. Let's just get rid of those bits because we don't need them. And hopefully we're kind of seeing how pickle files are very closely related to the way in which you work with text files. There's a couple of headlines for us that we want to talk about. One is that write is a method that was defined when open was designed, but dump comes in later. It is just a straightforward function. It's not a method that works with this class. The file object class. It is just a function, a straightforward function. It takes on 2 arguments. It takes on the piece of data that you want to store and the name of the file, not the name of the file, the file handle, the file that you want to put it in. But other than that, it's, dump is very, very straightforward. You just put those 2 things in. Let's run it. I'll stop waffling on, and you can see you've got this stock program. You can't really see what it looks like. I'll just open it in a text file because it looks like gobbledygook, but it is there and it's been created. Okay, we ought to just spend a little time looking at how you can actually start to open up a binary file and start reading off all the bits of data and then reconstructing your array of records. So we'll have a look at that now. Okay, we're just going to have a look at how we read binary files. It's worth us just looking back at reading a normal text file. So I've got a text file that says stock. It's got that bit of information in it. It can read all of those bits and pieces and actually construct an array of records. You can see we use that temp just to create a record called item there and just append it to the array. Well, it doesn't do anything at the moment when we run it, but we can start to print some bits and pieces off just to have a look. So we'll print off the items array just to see what that looks like and run through it, and you can see you've got an array, you've got the square brackets and you've got those objects. You can also just pick out something from that array. I'm going to pick out the first item, so we'll say index 0 and run it, and you can see that you've got that object. What kind of data type is it? It's item. You created your own data type. We can access the attributes again, so we can go name because they are public, so we can just go straight into it. We've got keyboard, etc. So we can read that text file and we can actually create an array of records, which is a really good way of handling things. What we are going to do is modify all of this, so we're reading from the binary file that we've made. So we're going to do the same thing now, just to avoid having to do pickle dot load or those bits. I'm just going to say from pickle import all. It's not terribly good advice because you could be importing other things, of course, and there'd be a clash of names, so you've got to be a bit careful with that, but it just makes it clearer to start off with. Let's modify this, what we're doing with our text file. It's not a text file, it's stock.p, just to show you that we do have that. It was this thing here that just looked like a load of gobbledygook. You can kind of make out some bits, but that's what that was. So the other thing that we do is just to change the bit at the end, the mode in which we're opening it, and we want to read binary, so we'll just put RB. So there are the only differences when it comes to your file handle, which is nothing to do with pickle. It's just saying I want to open this file. It is a .p file, and the mode is going to be read binary. It's just going to stay the same. We just want this number. Oh, let's get this read line. I need this metadata first of all. So what you use is load. Now then, just to be clear on something, if the way you've imported it was import pickle, which is a much safer way of doing it, you can't just access load straight away. You have to go pickle.load. But I just want to clear something up, that is not, load is not a method on a pickle object. All of this is just the name of an identifier of a subroutine called load. We just use this pickle dot notation to avoid clashes. That's all it is. But we don't need to do that in this case. We're just going to go and do that, say load. And again, load, if you think about this, is not part, it's not as if we've extended this class called open. We haven't started to write more methods. Load is being developed as part of the pickle library after open was designed. And this needs to just take one argument. It's a bit like readline just is attached to that FH. All you do here is just put the FH there that you want to load it up, and that's all you do. And you can say number is equal to load up FH. So load is the equivalent of readline. Just notice, however, readline is a method that was defined as part of this open class. That's why we've got fh.readline, and we don't need to pass any arguments to it. It's just going to read the first line and it keeps a track of where it is. Load is just a basic subroutine, the kinds of subroutines that you started off right at the very beginning with your Python. So it does take an argument, it just takes the fh. So it's not a method, and that's why we pass. The only bit of information I need is what's the file that I'm reading a line from. Just notice the improvement that we've got though with this. I don't need to cast it. I don't need to say, oh, this was an integer. It knows it's an integer. It's doing that. Let's do this bit. We're getting the name. I'm just going to redo that part. Name is equal to, instead of readline, we just say load fh, and that's it. Notice that we don't have to do .strip because there's no new lines in there. It's load does work in the same way that readline does, that it keeps a track of which bit of data you've got in your binary file, so it moves on to the next piece of data in your binary file. So I don't need the strip, which was very nice. And then I've got the cost, so let's just put that in. Cost equals load fh. Look how good that is when it comes to reading binary files. Don't need to cast it, don't need to strip it, because there's no new lines, and I know it's preserving the data type. It's just loading it up, and cost will automatically be a float because that's how it was stored. So that's it in actual fact. You've done it, but we've made that comparison with readline, that readline keeps a track of where we are, but it is a method, so it's attached to our object fh, our file handle. However, load is just a communal garden subroutine. I do need to pass some information to it. What do I pass? Simply the file handle, because load, like readline, just keeps a track of where you are. It's just moving on to the next thing each time, every time you use it. So I think it's very good to kind of look at your handling of binary files and your text files at the same time and try to make some sense out of it. Other than that, we've done it, it's worked. So let's just run it and hopefully there's no errors in it, and then we'll do the same thing we've done before, just test it. We'll print off the entire array, so we should find an array of objects. So I'll run through that. That's looking good. Let's pick out one of them. I'm going to pick out the second object in that array, the second record, which is that one, and I want to just see what the name is. I can access that because the attributes are public in this case, and I could do that. The only sort of parting thing I would say is this isn't terribly good. You are better off, in fact, just by saying import pickle, but that does mean that, and that's safer because you're less likely to clash with names of imported functions and classes and non-runnable code. It just means that load now won't work. It won't know what it is. If you run it, it'll say load is unknown or something. Load is not defined. So you just have to go pickle dot load, but it's not a method. This entire thing, pickle dot load, is simply an identifier for a subroutine, but it's a good way of doing things. It's quite what we call idiomatic is Python. The meaning of things is not obviously sort of easy to translate. It depends on its context, if that makes sense. So I understand why it can be confusing for people. Let's just have a look at another thing. We've got a load there, it won't know, so we go pickle.load would be better, and pickle.load there would be better every time we're doing it. So I think we've got them all now. Let's just run through it. Yes, it's working. So that's really, we do sort of want you to import in that way so that you're not going to run into any clashes of names of non-runnable code, whether it's classes or subroutines or other data types. Okay, I think that's enough for you to kind of run with it. Okay, thanks Charlie for that. Contact me if you are unsure of anything. Thank you.